The security guard didn't even look up when he stopped me. "Ma'am, you're not on the list." Behind him, the auditorium doors were wide open flags, polished brass rows of crisp uniforms, and my family walking straight past me like I didn't exist. My father's voice echoed in my head, calm and proud. "Today is a big day for your brother." They thought my only role was to stand on the sidelines and clap. They had no idea that in less than an hour I would walk back through those doors wearing the highest rank in the room, and everything they believed about me would collapse in silence. Part 1, the day I was meant to stand aside. "Honey," my father said, patting my shoulder the way he used to when I was 12, "today is a big day for your brother." He said it slowly, deliberately, like he was reminding me of my place, like I might have forgotten. "We're all very proud of his accomplishments." I nodded because that's what I'd been trained to do. Smile. Agree. Don't disrupt the moment. Don't make it about yourself. The late spring air was cool and bright, the kind of clear May morning that makes everything look more hopeful than it really is. The parking lot outside the base auditorium was already filling up pickup trucks with veteran plates, sedans with folded programs on the dashboard, families dressed in their best versions of respectability. American flags lined the walkway, snapping sharply in the breeze. My brother's day. My father walked ahead of me with that familiar squared-off posture, retired but never relaxed. My mother followed close beside him, adjusting her pearl earrings, already scanning the crowd for familiar faces. My sister-in-law walked just behind them, heels clicking confidently, her hand resting possessively on my brother's arm. And then there was me. I was dressed simply. A neutral coat. Nothing that drew attention, nothing that invited questions. Exactly how they preferred it. We reached the main entrance where 2 uniformed security officers were checking IDs against a digital guest list. My brother leaned in toward my father, grinning. "Front row seats today," he said. "Command said they saved the best section for family." My father smiled wide and proud, as they should. I stepped forward with them, reaching into my bag for my ID. The officer scanned my brother's badge, then my parents'. He nodded politely and waved them through. Then his eyes flicked to me. He took my ID, scanned it once, then again. A faint crease appeared between his brows. He looked up. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, you're not on the list." The words landed softly, professionally. Like a door closing without a sound. I felt my mother hesitate just for a second, then keep walking. My father didn't turn around. "I'm with them," I said evenly, nodding toward my family. The officer angled the tablet so I could see it. Names listed neatly one after another. Captain Robert Hayes, Mrs. Linda Hayes, Major Daniel Hayes, Mrs. Caroline Hayes. That was it. No mistake, no omission. My name was nowhere to be found. Behind me, the wind rattled the flagpoles. Somewhere inside, a brass band began warming up. My brother glanced back just long enough to see what was happening. A slow smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Oh," he said lightly, leaning closer to his wife. "Probably a mix-up. She's just, support side." He said it loud enough for the officer to hear. "And for me. She should wait out here," he added. "Wouldn't want to hold things up." My father finally turned. Not to me, but to the guard. "She's fine," he said curtly. "She'll find a seat later." Then he looked at me, his expression tightening with irritation, not concern. "Don't make this a scene," he said under his breath. "Today isn't about you." And just like that, they walked inside. All 4 of them. Leaving me standing at the threshold like a forgotten coat on a rack. The officer shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside." I did. I stood there on the concrete, the sun warming one side of my face, while the other stayed cold, watching the doors close behind my family. I'd played this role my whole life. The quiet one, the capable one, the daughter who didn't need attention. For as long as I could remember, my brother had been the story, the hero, the one my father introduced proudly to every former colleague, every neighbor, every stranger at the hardware store. "This is my son," he'd say. "He's in uniform." And when they asked about me, "This is my daughter," my father would say. "She works in an office." Like that explained everything. I leaned against the railing, letting the memory wash over me, the backyard barbecues thrown for my brother's promotions, the framed photos of him in uniform lining the hallway at home, the way my achievements were always acknowledged with a nod, then quietly set aside. I'd learned early that in our family service only counted if it was visible, loud, easy to explain. Inside the auditorium, applause erupted. They were probably taking their seats now. Front row, smiling, my brother soaking it in like sunlight. And me, I was exactly where they expected me to be. Outside, invisible, supportive, silent. The funny thing was I felt calm. Not numb, not broken. Calm. Because this wasn't a mistake, it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was deliberate. And that meant something else was deliberate too. I checked my watch. 37 minutes. That's how long they had before the truth walked back through those doors. I straightened, adjusted my bag, and took a slow breath. Let them have their moment, I thought. Let them believe I belonged on the sidelines. Today I wouldn't argue, I wouldn't explain, I wouldn't ask for permission. Today I would walk in when I was called. Not as a daughter, not as a sister, but as something they never imagined I could be. Standing outside that auditorium, I didn't feel surprised. That was the part that hurt the most. Surprise implies hope. Hope that maybe this time things would be different. Hope that someone would turn around, call my name, realize something had gone wrong. But hope had been trained out of me years ago. As I waited, the sharp scent of cut grass and hot pavement pulled me backward in time, the way certain smells always do. Back to the summer afternoons of my childhood when our backyard became a stage, and my brother was always the star. The day Daniel received his acceptance letter into the academy, my father came home early from work for the first time I could remember. He threw open the back door letter raised like a trophy. "He did it," he shouted. "My son did it." By sunset, there were cars lining the street. Neighbors, former colleagues, old Navy friends I'd never met before filled the yard with folding chairs and loud laughter. Someone hung an American flag across the fence. Someone else fired up the grill. My mother ordered a cake so large it barely fit through the door. Thick blue icing, white letters. "Congratulations, future officer." I stood near the porch, paper plate in my hands, watching my father introduce Daniel over and over again. "This is my boy," he said, "carrying on the Hayes legacy." And I clapped, I smiled, I meant it too. I loved my brother, I was proud of him. But standing there, I felt something else settle quietly into my chest, a realization that I didn't yet have words for. There was only room for one story in our family, and it wasn't mine. That same week, I'd won a national academic award, a big one. My guidance counselor called it exceptional. My teachers shook my hand like I'd done something rare. I brought the plaque home, heart racing, rehearsing what I'd say. That night, after the guests left and the yard grew quiet, I found my father in his recliner reading the paper. "Dad," I said, holding it out carefully, "I won." He glanced at it, nodded once. "That's nice," he said. "Good work." Then he folded the paper and added, "You know Daniel's going to need to start running every morning if he wants to be ready." And just like that, the moment passed. I learned then that excellence wasn't enough. Not if it didn't look the right way. Years later, when I told them I'd been accepted into a classified program, one that required interviews, clearances, background checks my parents never even knew existed, my father's reaction was immediate. "Intelligence," he said the word sharp with disappointment. "That's not real service." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "That's support, paperwork, analysts, people who stay behind desks while others do the real work." My mother tried to soften it, she always did. "At least it's safe," she said gently. "That's something." Safe. As if the absence of visible danger meant the absence of sacrifice. They never asked what I did there. Never asked what it took to earn my position. Never asked why the interviewers stared so long, why they tested me the way they did. They decided instead. And once they'd decided, they stopped listening. So I stopped explaining. I became the daughter who didn't need praise, the one who didn't need attention, the one who could handle herself. When Daniel got promoted, we celebrated. When he deployed, we prayed. When he came home, we gathered around the table to hear his stories, some real, some embellished, all eagerly received. When I worked late nights, missed holidays, answered calls at impossible hours, no one noticed. And maybe that was my fault. Maybe I made it too easy. Outside the auditorium, a laugh drifted through the doors, familiar, confident. Daniel's laugh. I imagined him inside, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, basking in the certainty that this day belonged to him. My father would be beaming, my mother would dab at her eyes. And if anyone asked about me, She couldn't make it, my father would say, or worse, he wouldn't mention me at all. I shifted my weight, glancing down at my watch again. 32 minutes. A memory surfaced uninvited. The 4th of July a few years back, another gathering, another stage. Daniel stood at the center of the deck, drink in hand, recounting a deployment story to a circle of admirers. My father chimed in with technical details, adding weight, adding authority. I knew the real report. I'd read it months earlier, quietly, professionally. I knew which parts were exaggerated. I said nothing. Later, my brother slung an arm around my shoulders, laughing. So he said loudly, "How's life behind a desk treating you? Must be nice sitting in air conditioning while the rest of us do the heavy lifting." Everyone laughed. I laughed too. That was my role. But something shifted that night. Not outwardly, no argument, no tears. Internally. I realized then that if I ever waited for them to see me, I'd be waiting forever. Respect, I understood, wouldn't come from explanation. It would come from something else. A low rumble of applause rolled through the auditorium again. The ceremony must have begun. I stood a little straighter. They thought they had decided my place. They thought today was about celebrating one child. They thought I was still the daughter who stood quietly clapping on cue. Inside my bag, my phone buzzed once, a brief vibration I recognized instantly. A single message. "Stand by." I exhaled slowly, steadying myself. This wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about no longer shrinking to make them comfortable. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting to be invited. I was waiting to be called. People like my father love clear lines. Front lines, back lines, heroes and helpers. In his world, service was something you could point to on a map or hang on a wall. It roared, it burned, it left visible scars. Anything else was just noise. If he had ever really asked what my work looked like, I might have told him about the room. We called it the operations cell, though most people outside would have called it a basement if they'd known it existed at all. No windows, no clocks. The air recycled so thoroughly it always smelled faintly of metal and cold coffee. The lights were dimmed not for atmosphere, but to keep the screens readable. My desk was a curved console facing a wall of monitors. Maps layered over maps, data streams, live feeds, timelines that shifted faster than most people could read them. This was where I worked. This was where I fought. One night in particular returned to me as I stood outside the auditorium, the memory sharp enough to feel like a bruise. It had been a Tuesday, or maybe a Wednesday. The days blurred together in that place. We were tracking irregular activity in a maritime corridor most civilians had never heard of. Cargo traffic looked normal on the surface, but the underlying data told a different story, tiny deviations, delays that didn't make sense unless you knew what to look for. I did. My team fed me updates in a low, steady cadence through my headset. Signal integrity holding, thermal feed coming online. Pattern shift detected Sector 9. I leaned forward, eyes moving between screens, fingers flying across the console. Zoom, that I said, and overlay last week's traffic. The image sharpened, something small slid into focus. There. A shadow that didn't belong. Hold, I said, voice calm, heart racing. That's not drift, that's deliberate. A pause. Then copy, confirming. On another screen, a friendly unit's marker blinked steadily, unaware, moving straight toward a convergence point that suddenly looked a lot like a trap. I felt the room narrow around me the way it always did when everything mattered all at once. Divert them, I said. Now, 2 degrees starboard, slow approach. Command will want confirmation. They don't have time, I replied. Do it. Seconds passed. Then the markers shifted. Another feed flared to life, unidentified signatures lighting up like sparks. My stomach clenched. If that unit had stayed on course, they would have sailed straight into it. Later, much later, when the adrenaline had faded and the reports were written, someone would note that an early course correction had prevented escalation. No names, no applause. Just a quiet line in a classified file. I remembered leaning back in my chair at 3:14 a.m., rubbing my eyes, my hands shaking just enough to remind me I was human. That was when my phone vibrated in my pocket. A text from Daniel. Must be nice working banker hours, it read. Some of us are actually out there. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I turned it off and went back to work. That was the night I stopped trying to explain. The irony, of course, was cruel. The unit I'd redirected. The one whose marker I watched drift just far enough away from danger. Daniels. I didn't know it at the time. I found out weeks later reading a routine personnel update recognizing the designation. I closed the file and sat there for a long time, the glow of the screens reflecting off my hands. I could have told him. I could have said that was me, that was my call. But I didn't. Because in our family information was power, and I'd learned the cost of giving mine away too easily. Outside the auditorium, the applause surged again, louder this time. A standing ovation, maybe. My watch ticked forward. 21 minutes. The vibration in my bag came again, stronger this time. 5 minutes, the message read. Proceed to point. My pulse steadied. I stepped away from the railing and moved toward the side entrance I'd been instructed to use earlier, the one marked Staff Only. A different security detail stood there, older, sharper eyes assessing rather than dismissing. One of them glanced at my face, then down at his earpiece. Yes, sir, he murmured quietly. She's here. He stepped aside without asking for my ID. Inside the hallway was hushed, carpeted, the noise of the ceremony muffled by thick walls. I followed the corridor until it opened into a small waiting room just off the main stage. A mirror covered one wall. I stopped in front of it. The woman looking back at me was composed, professional, unremarkable at first glance. The same woman my family thought they knew. I slipped off my coat slowly and folded it over the back of a chair. Underneath was my uniform. Immaculate, pressed, earned. From my bag I removed the insignia case. The metal was cool against my palm as I opened it. I affixed the rank deliberately, the soft click of the pins locking into place echoing louder in my ears than it should have. Each one felt like a decision made long ago. A promise kept. I straightened, squared my shoulders, and met my own gaze. They thought I worked behind a desk. They weren't wrong. They just never understood what that desk could do. Through the wall the music shifted, the cadence changed. The master of ceremonies was transitioning. I took a breath. It was almost time. The waiting room felt smaller the longer I stood there. Not cramped, just contained, like everything unnecessary had been stripped away. 2 leather chairs, a small table with a pitcher of water, a flag folded with ceremonial precision in a glass case on the far wall. The hum of the building's ventilation system was steady, almost soothing. I'd spent years in rooms like this. Rooms where decisions were made quietly, where outcomes shifted without fanfare, where authority didn't need to announce itself to be absolute. A soft knock sounded at the door. "Ma'am," a voice said, respectful and measured. "They're ready." I nodded once. As the door opened, the muffled sounds of the auditorium rushed in applause, tapering off the low murmur of hundreds of voices settling back into their seats. The scent of polished wood and old fabric replaced the sterile air behind me. I followed the aide down a narrow corridor that ran parallel to the stage. The walls were lined with framed photographs, former commanders, historic moments, medals frozen in time. Men and women who had served in ways the public would never fully understand. I wondered briefly how many of them had stood exactly where I was now. We stopped just before the final set of doors. Through the narrow gap I could see the audience. Rows upon rows of uniforms, dress blues, service whites, ribbons aligned perfectly over hearts that had carried far more weight than most people ever knew. Front row. My family. My father sat rigidly, hands clasped in his lap, his jaw set in that familiar way that meant he was proud and in control. My mother leaned slightly toward him, whispering something I couldn't hear. My brother sat on the aisle posture, relaxed confidence radiating from him, as naturally as breath. He looked exactly like someone who believed the world had arranged itself correctly. The aide leaned closer, on my signal. I focused on my breathing. Slow in, slow out. The master of ceremonies stepped back to the podium, clearing his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice rich and practiced. "Before we proceed, we have a brief, unscheduled addition to today's program." A ripple of curiosity moved through the crowd. My brother tilted his head, brow furrowing slightly. My father straightened, attention sharpening. The MC continued. "We often honor service that is visible, service that takes place on ships, in the air, on the ground. But today we recognize another kind of service, one that operates in silence, in shadows, one whose impact is felt not in headlines, but in lives preserved. I felt the shift before I saw it. The room leaned forward. "Please rise," the MC said for Rear Admiral Elizabeth Hayes. The doors opened, and the world changed. I stepped out into the light, the sound hitting me all at once, chairs scraping back, the sudden unified movement of hundreds of people standing as one. A wave of disciplined respect that surged through the room without instruction. Protocol. Reflex. Honor. I didn't look at my family at first. I kept my eyes forward, my steps measured, my spine straight. But I felt them. I felt my father freeze. I felt my mother's hand fly to her mouth. I felt my brother's confidence collapse into something pale and unrecognizable. I reached the stage and turned, facing the sea of faces. Only then did I let my gaze drift. My father's expression had gone slack, like someone trying to read a language he didn't believe existed. My mother's eyes were wide, glassy, her lips trembling. My brother sat frozen halfway between standing and sitting, his hands gripping the arms of his chair, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. "Rear Admiral." The words hung in the air like a verdict. The commanding officer stepped forward, his presence commanding without effort. He met my eyes and offered a small knowing nod. As he pinned the medal to my uniform, he spoke softly, just for me. "It's time." Then he turned back to the microphone. "Admiral Hayes has spent over a decade leading operations that most of us will never hear about," he said. "Her work has directly prevented escalations, protected assets, and saved lives, often without recognition, often without thanks." The room was silent. Last year alone, he continued intelligence under her command, identified and neutralized a threat that would have resulted in catastrophic loss. I saw my brother's face drain of color. He knew. Because he knew that designation, that operation, that near miss everyone in his unit still talked about in hushed tones. That operation, the officer said evenly, involved this very command. My father's hands began to shake. I stood there steady, the weight of the medal warm against my chest. Not triumphant. Resolved. This wasn't about embarrassment. It was about truth. When the applause finally came, it was thunderous. Not polite, not obligatory. Earned. As I saluted and stepped back, I felt something loosen inside me, something that had been clenched for so long I hadn't realized how much it hurt. As I returned to my seat in the front row, my family still hadn't moved. I passed them without a glance. For the first time in my life, I wasn't stepping aside. I was being recognized exactly where I stood. And there was no undoing that. Applause is a strange thing when you're standing in the center of it. It doesn't arrive all at once. It swells. It gathers momentum like a tide pressing against you from every direction until the sound feels almost physical, vibrating through your ribs, settling into your bones. I stood there as it washed over me, my hands steady at my sides, my face composed in the way years of service had taught me to be. Inside, something quieter was happening. A release. Not joy, exactly. Not relief. Recognition. The commanding officer stepped back, giving the crowd a moment, then returned to the podium. "And now," he said, "we will resume today's scheduled program." Just like that, the ceremony moved on. But nothing was the same anymore. I returned to my seat beside senior officers whose names I'd known for years, men and women who nodded to me with a respect that felt effortless, unforced. One of them leaned over briefly. "Long overdue," he murmured. I inclined my head, accepting it without ceremony. Across the aisle, my family remained frozen. My father sat stiffly, eyes fixed forward, his mind clearly somewhere else. My mother's hands trembled as she smoothed her skirt again and again, like the fabric might anchor her back to reality. My brother hadn't sat down yet. He seemed stuck halfway between standing and collapsing, his body unsure which instinct to obey. I didn't look away first. For a moment I met his eyes. There was no anger in mine, no satisfaction, just a calm, unyielding clarity. Then I turned back to the stage. The master of ceremonies announced my brother's name again, inviting him up for the next segment of the program. There was a beat of hesitation before he rose, the confidence he'd worn so comfortably earlier now fractured. He walked differently this time. Not defeated, but unsettled. His acceptance speech was shorter than before, tighter. The practiced charm dulled around the edges. When he thanked our parents, his voice faltered just barely. When he reached the end, he avoided my gaze entirely. The applause that followed was polite, respectful. But it lacked something. I felt it in the room, the subtle recalibration happening in hundreds of minds at once, the unspoken realization that the story they thought they knew had been incomplete. After the final salute and the dismissal of the formation, the auditorium buzzed with conversation. Officers rose, families clustered together, hands were shaken, congratulations exchanged. I stood and was immediately surrounded. A general I'd worked with years earlier clasped my hand warmly. A civilian official thanked me for keeping the lights on when no one knew the power was flickering. Someone pressed a business card into my palm, murmuring about a future briefing. Through it all, I remained aware of the movement on the edge of my vision. My family was approaching. They moved together close and rigid like a unit advancing into unfamiliar terrain. My brother was in front now. His jaw was tight, his eyes sharp with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear. Behind him, my father walked slowly, his shoulders heavier than I'd ever seen them. My mother clutched his arm, her face pale. The conversations around me faded as people sensed the shift. My brother stopped a few feet away. So he said, his voice low, controlled. That was impressive. Impressive. A word he'd never used for me before. You could have told us, he continued. You let us believe. I didn't let you believe anything I said calmly. The words surprised him. They surprised me too, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. My father finally looked at me then, really looked. Elizabeth, he said, my name sounding unfamiliar on his tongue. Why didn't you say something? I studied him for a moment. His uniform was immaculate. His medals gleamed. He had built his entire identity on service, on hierarchy, on knowing where everyone stood. And for the first time, he didn't know where to place me. I tried, I said simply, years ago. Silence fell between us. Around us, the room continued to hum, but it felt distant, muffled, like we were standing behind glass. My brother ran a hand through his hair, frustration bleeding through his composure. You stood there, he said, his voice rising slightly, and let everyone think I was lecturing you about sacrifice, about service. Do you know how that makes me look? I met his gaze evenly. I wasn't thinking about how you looked, I replied. I was thinking about doing my job. His mouth opened, then closed. My mother let out a small broken sound. We didn't know, she whispered. You would have done exactly what you've always done, I said gently, rewritten it in a way that made sense to you. My father's face tightened. That's not fair. No, I agreed, it's not. A uniformed aide appeared at my side, impeccable timing as always. Admiral, he said quietly, the conference room is prepared should you prefer privacy. I nodded. To be continued, I said to my family not unkindly. As we walked down the corridor together, the sound of our footsteps echoed softly against the polished floor. No one spoke. Inside the room, the door closed with a muted click. My brother turned on me immediately. You humiliated us, he said. You made us look like fools. I poured a glass of water, my movements unhurried. I didn't do anything, I replied. The truth did. My father sank into a chair, suddenly looking older than I'd ever seen him. I spent my life teaching you what mattered, he said quietly. And I listened, I said. I just learned a different lesson. The room fell silent again. This time it felt final. Outside, duty waited. Inside, a reckoning had begun. The conference room was soundproofed in a way that made silence feel heavier, more deliberate. No echo. No ambient hum. Just the quiet presence of truth waiting to be acknowledged. My brother paced the length of the room like a caged animal, his dress shoes striking the floor in sharp, uneven beats. My mother sat rigidly in one of the leather chairs, clutching her purse, as if it were a life raft. My father remained seated, elbows on his knees, staring at the carpet. I set my glass of water down and folded my hands. Say what you need to say, I told them calmly, but say it honestly. Daniel stopped pacing. You let me stand up there, he said, his voice tight, and talk about sacrifice, about duty. You let me talk down to you. I tilted my head slightly. Did I? He frowned. You knew what you'd done. You knew what rank you held. Yes, I said, I did. Then why didn't you stop me, he demanded. The question hung in the air, raw and unguarded. Because I said quietly you weren't talking to me. He stared at me confused. You were talking to an idea, I continued. A version of me you'd already decided was smaller, safer, less important. If I'd interrupted you, you would have argued. If I'd explained, you would have minimized. And if I'd demanded respect, you would have resented me for it. My mother looked up sharply. That's not true. I turned to her. When was the last time you asked me what I actually do? I asked gently. Not where I work, not if I'm safe, but what my responsibilities are. Who depends on me? She opened her mouth, then closed it. My father shifted in his chair. I raised you both to serve, he said at last, to put country before self. You raised us to perform, I replied. There's a difference. His jaw tightened. Everything I did, he said I did, so you wouldn't have to fight the same battles. And yet I said you decided which battles counted. Daniel scoffed, running a hand over his face. So what, he said bitterly, you're saying none of this is on you. You couldn't have trusted us with the truth. I met his gaze steadily. I trusted the mission, I said, and I trusted myself. He laughed once harshly. You think that makes you better than us? No, I said, it makes me responsible. My phone vibrated on the table between us. Once, twice. The distinct pattern of an encrypted alert. I glanced at the screen, then back at them. I have to take this, I said. My brother threw his hands up. Of course you do. I stepped just outside the door, spoke quietly into the phone, listened, nodded once. Understood, I said. I'll be available. When I returned, something had shifted. My father was standing now, one hand braced on the table. He looked smaller than he had an hour ago, not weaker, just older. I didn't see you, he said, his voice low. I thought if I acknowledged your work, I'd be admitting I was wrong about what mattered. The admission landed harder than any accusation. I didn't need you to be wrong, I said. I needed you to be curious. My mother stood and came closer, her eyes wet. We were proud, she said. We just didn't know how to show it. I considered her words carefully. Pride without respect is just comfort, I said. It keeps things easy, familiar. Daniel exhaled sharply, his anger finally giving way to something else, something like fear. You don't need us anymore, he said. It wasn't a question. I looked at him for a long moment. I never needed permission to be who I am, I said. But I did want family. That hasn't changed. My father swallowed. What happens now, he asked. I took a breath. Now, I said, we decide whether this relationship continues the way it was or whether it starts over. Daniel shook his head. You're giving ultimatums now. I'm setting boundaries, I corrected. There's a difference. I turned to my father. If you want me in your life, I said, you don't get to diminish what I do because it doesn't fit your definition of heroism. I turned to my mother. You don't get to reduce my worth to whether I've built a life that looks comfortable to you. Then back to my brother. And you don't get to measure yourself against me like this is a competition. It never was. The room was silent again. Finally, my father nodded once. I can try, he said. It wasn't an apology. But it was a start. The aide knocked softly at the door. Admiral, he said, your car is ready. I picked up my bag and slipped my coat over my arm. At the door, I paused. I love you, I said, not turning around, but I won't be dismissed again. Then I stepped into the hallway, my heels echoing with a steadiness that felt earned. Behind me, the door closed. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was leaving something unfinished. 6 months passed. Not the kind of months filled with dramatic phone calls or sudden apologies. These were quieter months, careful ones. Months where change didn't announce itself, it revealed itself slowly in small, deliberate actions. The first time I noticed something was different, it was a Sunday afternoon. I walked into my parents' living room, the same room that had framed my childhood, the same couch, the same bookshelf, the same mantel crowded with photographs and medals that told a very specific story. But something new stood against the far wall. A display case. Dark cherry wood, glass front, tastefully lit. My father stood in front of it with a soft cloth in his hand, polishing the glass with slow, methodical care. His own medals were arranged neatly on the lower shelves, my grandfather's beside them. And in the center at eye level was mine, My Distinguished Service Medal rested on a navy velvet stand flanked by a framed photograph from the ceremony. Not oversized, not hidden, not overshadowed. Centered. My mother noticed me first. She smiled, really smiled, and set down the tray she was carrying. "He built that himself," she said quietly, said it was time the story was complete. My father didn't turn around right away. When he did, his expression was different, less guarded, less certain. "I didn't know how to talk about your work," he admitted, "so I avoided it. That was easier." I nodded. "I know." Dinner that night felt unfamiliar in the best possible way. No one interrupted. No one redirected the conversation. When my father asked me about leadership challenges, real ones, I answered honestly within the limits I could. When my mother listened, she didn't search my face for discomfort or loneliness. She listened to understand. Later, as the dishes were cleared and the evening settled into that gentle quiet unique to family homes, my brother and I found ourselves on the back porch. The same porch where we'd spent countless summer nights growing up. The swing creaked softly beneath us. "I was wrong," Daniel said finally, his voice low. "About you, about what matters." I didn't rush to respond. "I thought being the hero meant being seen," he continued. "Turns out I was just scared of what I couldn't measure." I looked out at the darkened yard, fireflies blinking in and out like signals. "It was never a competition," I said. "I just needed space to exist without being compared." He nodded slowly. "I'm proud of you," he said. And this time it didn't feel like a performance. When I left that night, I didn't feel victorious. I felt settled. The truth is, respect didn't come from that ceremony. It came from what followed. From boundaries held, from silence broken, from a family learning slowly how to listen. I didn't step into the light to prove them wrong. I stepped into it so I could finally stop hiding. And maybe that's the part of this story that matters most. Because so many of us are taught to shrink to wait our turn to applaud quietly, to believe our worth depends on someone else recognizing it. But worth doesn't work that way. It never did. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever been the one standing just outside the door unseen and underestimated, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? What part of this story felt familiar? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. And if you want more stories like this, stories about quiet strength, earned respect, and the courage to claim your place, subscribe and stay with us. We have many more journeys to share. And this one finally feels complete.